Hello, everybody. Hope you all are doing well today. I just want to mention, first and foremost, I hope you are not necessarily at your computer as of right now, because today is glorious. What a day to be outside, especially in February. We've got some clouds around here, but the temperature is outstanding. So, I hope you have some opportunity to go outside and just again enjoy just being in the high country around here. So I also want to mention again to keep an eye out on your reflection papers as well as the discussion board. I've gotten one or two emails about the reflection paper. So if you've got some inquiries, if you've got some troubles, this is what I'm here for. So please take that opportunity to send me an email. Let me know if there's anything that I can help you with, and we'll try to make that happen. Try to make it to where you have the best possible product to submit for this particular class. So, like I said, I think a lot of everything that I've gotten so far for the first one was really good. There's obviously things we can work on, but just kind of take these critiques in terms of how we can better our arguments, and just try to include those into your next assignment there. So again, take that opportunity to really make the next paper that much better. Sorry, mine's a little off today. So I looked through the syllabi today, and I realized that I was ready to talk all about social judgment theory when what I was supposed to be looking at was social learning theory. But that's okay. I've got a lot of experience talking about this one in terms of the work of Albert Bandura, and this is a pretty interesting conceptual framework in terms of not only our cognitive ability to process something, but also in the ability to be able to recognize when we're viewing other people do things. So I mentioned this last video in terms of the notion of viewing people and how we disassociate or associate ourselves with these actions, given things like, do we view these as virtuous versus do we view these as unethical type of behaviors. The other thing we can look at is terms of, we can look at how people are viewed and judged and criticized, and the actions that we take in regards to those things. So, we can take a look at what Albert Bandura experimented on, which he used videos and wanted to see how do people react when they view certain televised messages. So, one of the things he did was he had young children watch another young child on a television set. And the action of it was this young child hitting what was called a Bobo doll. So I don't know if you've ever heard of these things. It's the inflatable dolls that actually have a weight at the bottom of the base of the doll. So when you hit it, it would fall to the ground and then bounce back up. I'm actually making these gestures knowing full well that you can't see them. So they would show these kids hitting the Bobo doll and it falling down and then coming back up. And depending on the condition, they would be either praised for it or scolded by it, or nothing would happen at all. And so the other kids who are watching it may see a certain condition. So if they see that the child is being praised, they're more inclined to replicate the behavior that they saw on television. So they would go nuts and hitting this Bobo doll. Whereas if they were scolded, naturally everybody who would be viewing this particular video, they'd be like, I saw what happened to that kid. I'm not doing it. So this kind of Albert Bandura thinking in terms of what it means to learn, and what it means to learn through other people in this case. And to give you a good example, because I was kind of struggling in terms of nowadays, do we have certain things that we watch on TV that we replicate some of these behaviors, or maybe, and this is the one I had a little bit more trouble thinking about, was maybe not engaging in a behavior because they know that they're going to be scolded in some way or another. So this is a really fascinating subject, and although there have been plenty of studies that have said, this isn't quite accurate in some scenarios. There's also the notion of what's called limited effects model that says, yes, for some kids they might replicate some behaviors and then others might not. This is the nature of psychology and social psychology in the first place, that not every behavior is going to be unanimous across the board. But case in point, though, so I was thinking of behaviors that might be avoided because of these social pressures, because you might be viewing somebody. So one of the things that I came up with is thinking about something that I talked about a couple weeks ago, which was two-step flow, and being these opinion leaders that produce this information on Facebook, and they project what they've seen, and they have their own opinion towards it, and it goes to the masses. So I've seen this with certain people with political affiliations, that they have this very strong slant of where they sit in terms of the political spectrum. And so when they make these arguments in one direction or the other, whether you're conservative or liberal, in this case, they make these arguments. And so what happens, though, is they get scolded from a various consensus of people that disagree with their political affiliation. So what could happen is, one, the subject of the person on Facebook might not engage in that behavior again. So this is kind of theory of planned behavior with subjective norms, as we mentioned on Monday. But the other thing that we might look at is another person could sit there and say, I see this person being scolded. I want to avoid that, so I'm not going to engage that behavior. So this is where this particular set of what you'll see over here in environmental factors makes a big deal. So this little, as we'll call Triforce from The Legend of Zelda here, I'm showing my inner video game nerd over here. We'll mention these three areas of what affects our learning and how we process this information. So there's 7 things I want to cover. So first are these reciprocal determinism, of behavioral, personal, and environmental factors. So I want to go over them, but I also want to go over the Bandura psychology steps of modeling that talks about attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation, as they all kind of fall within this area of social learning. Excuse me. So before we do that, let's take a look at some of the things that come with this determinism versus that environmental factors. Now, I'm going a little bit out of order, but considering this is what we just talked about, this is a very appropriate angle to look at first. So these are usually your social norms. So environmental factors are your social norms. Their access in a specific community. They influence others in terms of the ability to change your own environment. So basically what this talks about is your culture that you belong to based in your environment. So for instance, I was just talking to a gentleman from Cincinnati, and we started talking about barbecue, for instance, and we get into the culture of different environmental factors of what makes certain barbecue the best. So I'm from Eastern North Carolina, so vinegar-based barbecue sauce is usually where I sit. So I'm going to get a couple comments in the YouTube channel of how they might disagree with me. That's kind of a loose example, but we might also have other things in terms of the types of behavior that we're used to. So we can think of jargon that we use. We can use a different dialect. We can think of how communities work. So you might consider, the United States, for instance, as an environmental factor, that we're very individualistic, whereas in many countries in South America, for instance, it's very collectivist. So same with chromenics. I think I'm saying that right. Chromenics, yeah. So basis in time, though, how we view time. So United States, we're very, very strong in terms of being on time, being exactly on time. In fact, if we're not on time or early, we're considered lazy. Whereas I had a wonderful professor from Brazil who would show up to class 15 minutes late every time. And we would be somewhat upset as a class because we're like, why are you coming in 15 minutes late? You're slacking off here. Whereas she would look at us and say, y'all are so uptight. And so the difference in terms of that environmental factors makes up a great deal of the way that we behave based on this social learning. And so, again, those environmental factors are huge because, again, I'm a person that likes to be on time. I'm punctual to a fault. And when I say that, I actually expect other people to adhere to my level of punctuality. And that can annoy some people, especially when we're talking about, like parties or something like that. I like people to be on time. So but that's just me. The other thing we can look at are cognitive factors in this particular case, which we can also label as personal factors. So that's a little interchangeable. So cognitive or personal, which is based on our knowledge, based on our expectations, based on our attitudes, our values, beliefs. We've covered over these. So I'm not going to go into too much depth of what is an attitude, what is a belief, what is a value, what are our behaviors. But we do bring individual knowledge to the table. And there are some concepts, and I'm drawing a blank on which one I was thinking of. Social identity theory and personal identity that actually talk about when, let's say, you're socialized into an organization for the first time. So you're joining an organization and you're a newcomer, you're a new employee, and there's this social consideration that goes along with everything. And so I did some research on craft breweries, for instance, and I talked about if you're a home brewer, you automatically have this set of personal factors or cognitive factors that indicates that you know a little bit more about this process than somebody that has no brewing experience at all. So you're going to come in to this level of socialization different than somebody that says, I like craft beer, but I don't know anything about the process. So that's where those personal factors come in. And again, these two, they can all work together. So environmental factors and personal factors can work really well together in terms of what you know versus the expectations of your environment. So you may have a lot of experience as a home brewer, for instance, but the organization that you may be working for has different expectations in terms of what you're supposed to be doing in any given point in time. So that's kind of that relationship between personal and environmental factors. Whereas behavioral deals a lot more with your skills or practice or self-efficacy towards those skills. So you might have a lot of confidence in terms of your behavior, your skills, set coming in. And so, again, that's where they work together in this case in terms of your knowledge, your skills. How does this work in terms of your level of learning in this particular case? So you can actually look at this from a media literacy perspective. So I don't know if you've ever taken anything with media literacy, but as you grow older, from a child from being an adolescent to much older ages. I don't know why I'm blanking on this case. You start to notice things in the media, not the media, but media-related programs, that we start understanding a little bit more of that learning process of what is an advertisement, what kind of plot stories are there. I noticed this with film. When I started to learn more about film, I noticed how to evaluate it a lot different. So these are some notions within this reciprocal determinism. But then there's the other stages of modeling, and I won't spend too much time on this, but they are important to consider. So the first, let me back up. In Bandura psychology, this modeling process is really important towards social learning. And it talks about these 4 steps. So the first one we get into is attention. So a person must pay attention to behavior to be able to learn from it. So it depends on what we give our attention to, if we have competing stimuli and other traits of an observer and the person being observed. So again, all of these come into play. First and foremost, you need to be able to pay attention to it. So if you look at, for instance, the elaboration likelihood model, one of the things that they talk about is the ability to process. which comes into play in terms of how you view media. Because sometimes when we're watching television, listening to radio, you know, browsing the internet, we're not quite all there in terms of, and what I mean by that is we're not quite all there in terms of our cognitive ability to process this information. Sometimes we just get home from work and just want to veg out and not think about anything. My wife, for instance, loves Harry Potter, but she turns it on as like background and will occasionally quote it when there's a quotable line coming up. This is very minimal attention in terms of what is actually being given. And there's also, again, as mentioned, this competing stimuli around it. So in this particular case, she might be choring around the house, or I might be choring around the house, and we don't pay a whole lot of attention to this. So the social learning is probably at a very low state in this case because we aren't actively trying to process information. However, you might be able to argue as well, I mean, this goes back to elaboration likelihood model, that some of our peripherals might actually be kind of taking over in terms of having a song stuck in your head. So like if you've ever watched the movie Inside Out and the Triple Mint Gum commercial, where it always gets stuck in their head. Now granted, does that lead to purchasing intention? That's a whole other story. But it did catch her attention, if not just for the jingle. I mean, that's how I've been kind of viewing the Tide ads from the Super Bowl. You know, it's a Tide ad. So again, I kind of base that off of that attention. So that's the first step. So there's attention, and then there's retention. So retention, I'm just trying to make sure I emphasize that so I don't get those two mixed up. So this refers to an individual remembering the behavior that they observe. And this might influence that individual in certain cases. We do a lot in advertising called retention tests and recall tests to see what do you remember about this commercial. Because it could be one thing that you saw it, you heard it, but it could be a whole other thing to be how much did you actually pay attention to it. So this could be mental pictures, verbal descriptions. People retain these behaviors that they've seen and be able to later remember or create that activity within their own actions. So sometimes we can imitate or emulate certain things that we've seen on TV. I mean, this is what a lot of parents would talk to me about. In this case, that they would say, my son or daughter saw this on television and I can't believe they retained it. Or it may not even be television. You know, I'm speaking of this like it's an exclusive media theory, and it's not. Because it can be like you said something and automatically your child has picked up on it. And you're like, where the hell did that come from? And that's important within retention here. So that's the second step. The other is reproduction. So reproduction refers to that transfer and symbolic ideas into actions. So, reproduction involves a person formulating his or her actions according to this molded behavior. And with practice, people improve on it. So, this can be, for instance, so I grew up. So my father, for instance, he played minor league baseball for a while. And I know he always wanted me to play baseball, and I was okay. Let me take that back. I was terrible at bat, but I liked to play in the infield. I loved playing first base. But the one thing that always caught my ear when I looked at sports, for instance, because I played a lot of sports when I was younger, and even still so forth now. I would always try to pay attention to people who were better than me and try to reproduce some of the outcomes that would come in terms of what they did in this particular case. So I still do watch a lot of hockey. And so when I played hockey, I tried to emulate certain things that I saw within what I was looking at. And so a lot of people consider these areas within social learning to be negative things because they keep going back to the Bobo doll and violence and so forth. Whereas if I'm watching this and I want to make myself better, this is an area that I will see the best and see what they do and what are their tactics and how did they position themselves. And I think I learned a lot from that. I actually talked to a bartender at one point that was mentioning about esports, for instance. I think it's called Battlefield. I'm not 100% sure, but he had a streamer that he liked to watch, and he says, I watch them to get better. And I mentioned that to a class, and they kind of wrote it also as a joke. Why would you watch a video game player just to get better at it? I'm like, isn't that the same thing we do in what would be considered, quote, normal sports? So that's that reproduction. The last one, so we went through attention, retention, reproduction, and now the last one is motivation. So a person needs to be motivated to reproduce that behavior. So typically we look at an incentive. So if we look at something positive, then we will have a greater likelihood of engaging in something. Whereas if there's a negative reinforcer, we'll likely reduce that likelihood of the model activity. So whatever it is, so if it's actual, like treats or something that someone might get, it may increase my behavior. If it's punishment, that may decrease my behavior. But we also might see it is if I watch something and this person maybe not gets punished, but they make a mistake, we say, okay, I don't need to be doing that. Or vice versa, if they succeed, it's something that I really want to put into practice. So, again, those are kind of the steps that we look at in terms of psychology of modeling. So that's our Theory Thursday for today. For Friday, I'm hoping to cover a little bit over Woodward and Cialdini as best I can in terms of talking about social proofs. For now, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Like I said, I hope you're enjoying this lovely weather outside. And again, like I said, if you got any questions, please let me know. You all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you tomorrow. All right. Bye.